My name is Matthew Miller. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Biochemistry and Biomedical Sciences at McMaster University. I'm also a member of the Michael G. DeGroot Institute for Infectious Disease Research and the McMaster Immunology Research Center. Outside of the university, I'm also a member of the National Advisory Committee on Immunization's High Consequence Infectious Disease Working Group. This is one of the groups that's tasked with making recommendations about the use of SARS-CoV-2 vaccines in Canada, as well as the National Variant of Concern Leadership Group, which provides advice and strategy on how to deal with SARS-CoV-2 variants.
Okay. Thank you for meeting us, Dr. Miller. We have a lot of vaccines in the world, right? We have Novavax, a lot of them. So a lot of people have been comparing and shopping for COVID vaccines. Why can that be a problem to compare and shop for the COVID-19 vaccines?
Well, right now, the issue, of course, is that there's much more demand than there is supply. And as a result of that, it's really imperative that we use the supply that we have as wisely as possible to protect the global population, and particularly those who are at the highest risk. While it's possible that in the long run, we may observe subtle differences between the vaccines in terms of their efficacy and effectiveness, right now, there's really not the type of data available to make those comparisons. And indeed, the data we do have shows conclusively that all of these vaccines perform very, very well in reducing the outcomes that we care about most when we're measuring vaccine effectiveness or efficacy, which is the prevention of severe disease and death. Where there have been reports of minor differences, it's mostly in the ability of these vaccines to protect against very mild, like cold-like symptoms. And while obviously it's great if a vaccine can do that, it's not really essential. What we really want to make sure we're doing is preventing people from becoming seriously ill. And so as a result of that, it's imperative that people try to get the first vaccine that's available to them as authorized in their respective jurisdiction, because that vaccine, the sooner they get it, is going to provide them with a heightened level of immunity and protection. And the more people get vaccinated quicker, the faster these vaccines will be able to provide sort of indirect community level protection, which will accelerate how quickly we see decreases in cases and are able to return to normal.
All right, thank you for that answer. Is it safe to return back to normal as we were pre-pandemic when you get your first dose only of any of the vaccines?
No, so we shouldn't sort of let our guard down after receiving the first dose. And there are a few reasons for that. On an individual level, we know that although one dose, again, seems to be very good in most people at preventing severe illness, it's clear that there's still a risk of infection, especially in light of the increasing circulation of some variants against which these vaccines are modestly less effective. For people who are generally low risk, that might not be the end of the world, because again, having one dose, even if you were to become infected, would probably mean that your symptoms would be very, very mild. But of course, there are still vulnerable people in our community who are high risk and who may have only received one dose. And those people, if they were to be infected, might still experience severe outcomes. And so the sort of staged approach to returning to normal is really important then. When people increasingly have one dose, it will make safe activities even safer, like outdoor activities where there's plenty of ventilation and there's the ability to spread out. Those become increasingly safe. And thankfully, we're at a stage where our ability to vaccinate people with a single dose is corresponding with the good weather months in the Northern Hemisphere. And so it's really easy to be able to get outside and enjoy those kinds of activities. As the second dose uptake increases throughout the summer and into the fall, that timing is also quite convenient because, of course, as the weather cools down, if we want to be together, we're forced to be together inside. And so ensuring that people get both doses in a timely manner before the cold weather sets in will ensure that as the fall and winter roll around, we can return to, what looks like as close to normal of activities as possible.
And of course, with, like, as you said, with the summer months, getting the second dose right before the start of school, it would be easier to return back to normal with in-person schooling and all of that, of course.
Yes, exactly. So part of being able to operate safely on campus and get back into classrooms and smaller spaces where, there's not the same kind of sort of infinite ventilation that there is outdoors, will require that people be really conscious of ensuring that they get those second doses in a timely manner to maximize protection and of course decrease transmission rates in the community, which, by the way, are largely driven right now by people in younger, low risk cohorts. And so although that population may not be extremely likely to have severe outcomes or be hospitalized, they're major drivers of transmission. And the more and more that demographic is vaccinated, the less and less community transmission we'll see as a result, which will in turn provide better protection for everyone in the community, especially those who are high risk.
What future applications could we see in the mRNA vaccine technology? Since 40 years ago, Katalin Kariko, a researcher in BioNTech, she created or curated the notion of using mRNA technology in the COVID-19 vaccines, which is a revolutionary feat in science and immunology. What future applications could we see that same technology in the future?
I think mRNA vaccines hold tremendous potential. They have some really unique properties that make them attractive to combat a whole series of indications. I think one of the things that's been astounding about the mRNA vaccine platform that's maybe somewhat underappreciated by people who aren't, vaccinology aficionados is the fact that, these mRNA vaccines for COVID-19 were not only the first-in-class mRNA vaccines to ever be administered on a widespread global scale, but also the first vaccines against this entire family of viruses. And so to see those vaccines have effectiveness levels as high as we've seen, as well as what looks to be an outstanding safety profile, is unbelievable. If someone had told me that these vaccines were going to be this successful, 18 months ago, I wouldn't have believed them. And I'm, a total vaccine optimist. So that really speaks well for the use and the acceptability of this platform for the population going forward in general. The nice thing about the platform is that it's essentially plug and play, meaning it's very easy to adapt mRNA vaccines to code for other antigens of interest. So these could be antigens from other viruses like influenza or RSV, which is a very common respiratory pathogen that can cause severe illness, especially in children. And interestingly, mRNA vaccines are also being tested for indications that we don't typically think of vaccines being used in, for example, in targeting cancers. So oftentimes in cancer, because of the genetic instability of those cells, cancers will either express mutated proteins or proteins that are, sometimes restricted normally to expression only during sort of like embryogenesis and early development. And our immune system is capable of seeing those proteins as if they were foreign and then eliminating the cells that express them. And so some cancers in particular have very well known what we call tumor-associated antigens that can be targeted by vaccines. And so that's another very exciting possible use of mRNA vaccines. I would say one final really exciting potential application of mRNA vaccines could be in the vaccination of young children, presuming that the safety profile holds up in that population. And the reason for that is because right now, it can be very difficult to vaccinate young children because the immunity that's provided by the mother early on protects the infant, but can actually sort of block the ability of a vaccine to cause that infant to generate their own immune response. So we have to vaccinate young children on this sort of razor's edge where their maternal immunity is waned enough for the vaccine to work, but not so much that they're at high risk of getting infected for a prolonged period. mRNA vaccines work in a way that bypasses some of the ability of the maternal immunity to block the vaccine from working. And so this may allow us to vaccinate children earlier at a stage where their protection would be more consistent and more high because we don't need to wait for that maternal immunity to wane.
Right, of course. And we could see children past 12 years old becoming vaccinated as the year progresses.
Yeah, so I think, the big question, of course, when we extend vaccines for usage in populations below what's considered to be adults, which is typically, kind of 16 to 18, is the safety profile, because children often have more vigorous immune systems. And so we want to make sure that the what are typically modest adverse effects associated with vaccination, like injection site soreness or sometimes low-grade fever for a short period of time or tiredness, don't reach a point in younger populations that it becomes a concern. And so right now, the safety profile has looked very, very good as Pfizer, for example, as well as Moderna have tested the vaccines in younger populations. And so long as that holds up, I think it's a near certainty that they'll continue to test them in younger populations. And so long as the safety continues to look acceptable, then I think that we can expect to see that platform used in lower age groups as well. Of course, another thing that can be done to avoid potentially adverse outcomes is simply to reduce the dose for younger children, which is often, just as effective, but can have the consequence of lowering some of the less desirable side effects of the vaccine.
Right. Okay. That sounds exciting. A question that prompted a lot of hesitancy, especially towards the beginning of the release of the vaccines, is how did we develop so many types of vaccines, mRNA technology, viral vectors, so on? How do we develop so many types of vaccines in a little over a year?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the reality, in fact, is that we didn't, that these vaccines as platforms had been tested for very long periods of time before the actual approval of these specific vaccines. And in fact, the viral vectored vaccines and mRNA vaccines had both already been developed in preclinical stages against MERS coronavirus, which is related to SARS-CoV-2, the causative agent of COVID-19, but thankfully has caused relatively rare infections, primarily in the Middle East. What's concerning about MERS coronavirus is that the mortality rate is very, very high. It can be as high as like 1 in 3 people who become infected die, which is, way higher than obviously what we see with COVID-19. But the success of those vaccines against that virus allowed us to know what part of the virus we needed to target and how to target it very quickly for SARS-CoV-2 because it's a closely related virus. And so that early work helped us to translate and very quickly build these vaccines for COVID-19 in a way that appeared to be, much quicker than it actually was in practice.
Now, there are a few questions from the community that we've asked our Instagram followers. How are we, or how should we be responding to the variety of COVID-19 variants that we've been seeing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So variants for viruses like coronaviruses are expected and are inevitable because viruses, just like other animal species and plant species, evolve over time. And in a situation where you have really widespread, huge amounts of global infection happening, that gives the virus a lot of chance to evolve because it has a unique chance to evolve in every single individual it infects. The good news right now is that all of the current variants are still susceptible to the protection mediated by vaccines. So although there's some differences when you look at maybe, how well antibodies generated by these vaccines neutralize particular variants, the antibody levels tend to be so high that even if there are differences, those differences still are above the threshold that's required for the vaccine to provide protection. So the best thing that we can do to deal with variants is make sure that we get 2 doses of our vaccines, because those will reduce the ability of the virus to evolve and will also reduce the ability of variants to spread. In the interim, before we're all vaccinated, what we need to make sure that we do is maintain a lot of the infection control measures that we know have been successful throughout the pandemic, which include things like masking and physical distancing and regular hand washing. All of those things protect against variants in the same way that they protect against the sort of original isolate of SARS-CoV-2 that started the pandemic. So just continuing on practicing the same good habits that we've all developed over the last 18 months or so, as well as continuing to ensure that everyone who is able can be vaccinated will do a great job in protecting us against variants in the same way that it protects us against the sort of original strain.
Mm-hmm. Right.
One of the things about some of these variants that has made them these quote unquote variants of concern is that they display higher transmissibility. And so the more transmissible a variant is, the sort of harder we have to work to prevent it from transmitting as well. And these, the typical masks that people are wearing, which are often like multi-layered cloth or fabric masks, even surgical masks, do an okay job at protecting us, but we can enhance their ability to protect by adding additional layers. And so certainly, if people, need to go out to the grocery store or, the pharmacy or places like that, where there's the necessity to be indoors in close proximity to other people, double masking is a pretty easy way to add an extra layer of protection.
So should we be wary of the side effects that may arise in the future after vaccination, and why or why not?
So no, I don't think we should be concerned. The reality is, with vaccines, almost all of the adverse reactions associated with the vaccines historically occur in very close proximity to the vaccination itself. And the reason for that actually, when you consider the science, is pretty straightforward, which is that like any drug, the likelihood of having an adverse effect happens in close proximity to receiving the drug itself. And the vaccine that we receive, we receive 2 doses of, and that material in the vaccine itself is very rapidly cleared from our body. And all that's left over is our immune response to the vaccine antigen. And of course, our body every single day is generating immune responses to all kinds of stuff that we're exposed to in the environment. If we're infected, we generate an immune response, and our immune system evolves so that those immune responses that we generate to protect us from pathogens don't harm us. And so after that dose is gone, the likelihood that you're going to have an adverse effect goes down substantially, because the only thing that's left of the drug, or the vaccine in this case, is the immune response that it stimulated, which is something that our body naturally does all the time. And so for that reason, the likelihood of long-term adverse effects is exceedingly low for vaccines. And indeed, what we found is even some of these severe rare side effects, like VIT, which has been observed for some of the viral vectored vaccines, occur in very close proximity to the vaccination being administered itself.
Right. Regarding actually the VIPIT and what has been announced about it is, people have been worrying about the AstraZeneca vaccines and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines since they see a lot of cases of thromboses or blood clots due to the vaccine itself. Although there may be a high correlation between the two, should we be concerned about it, and why does it actually happen?
Yeah, great question. So, even with vaccines, our risk tolerance tends to be much, much lower than it is for other drugs. And there's a very good reason for that. And the reason is that vaccines tend to be a unique class of drug in that they're one of the few drugs we give to otherwise healthy individuals. As a result of that, the tolerance for any adverse outcomes is very, very low. If you contrast that to something like a chemotherapeutic that's given to a patient with cancer, everyone is familiar, most people at least are familiar with some of the very sort of severe side effects of chemotherapy, a lot of gastric distress, sometimes hair loss. These are really nasty drugs in a lot of cases, but they're treating you from something that might otherwise be fatal. And so the tolerance for these adverse outcomes is very high. The thromboembolic events, or the thrombocytopenic events in other cases that are being observed in rare individuals who have received the viral vector vaccines, is something that we're obviously concerned about as a medical community, because it plays into our risk assessment of whether or not a vaccine is appropriate. Now, in general, these vaccines are very safe, and the sort of evidence for that is that almost all regulatory agencies worldwide have approved these vaccines on the basis of their safety. However, in places like Canada, and other jurisdictions where there are multiple vaccine options available, then the choice of which vaccine to get has to be weighed against the sort of amount of virus that's circulating at any given time. And that's what we've seen play out in Canada. So in Canada, when there was a lot of COVID activity, especially, for example, during the peak of the third wave, the risk-benefit ratio swayed strongly in favor of vaccinating with any vaccine because the risk of a severe outcome from infection was so high. But as the amount of virus decreases, the possibility that there could be a severe outcome with a viral vectored vaccine in some cases is higher than the likelihood that you would get a severe outcome from the infection, because the delay between getting the viral vectored vaccine and an mRNA vaccine is so short. In places where there's only viral vectored vaccines available, like we saw in the UK, for example, where their vaccine portfolio was heavily dependent on AstraZeneca, that again strongly sways the risk benefit equation into the strong benefit category. It's really complex. But what people should rest assured about is that we've seen regulators and advisory bodies in Canada deal with this very appropriately. When the benefit outweighed the risk, those vaccines were used. And when that equation started to change, we stopped using those vaccines. So I think that should provide people with the confidence to know that any vaccine that they're offered is the right vaccine to get at that time, and that everybody is very aware of these very rare adverse effects. And of course, the more we're aware of them, the more we can educate people about what types of things they might need to look for after vaccination and get followed up for if they experience some of those symptoms, which again sort of increases the overall safety.
Yeah, and what Canada has done really well is inform people to speak to their family physicians, for example, if they have any concerns, right? Whether someone has a heart condition and they might be at a higher risk of a blood clot in general, right? And that has been really effective in Canada with lessening that vaccine hesitancy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that the relationship between an individual and their primary care physician or their family doctor is extremely important. And Canada has done a good job at encouraging people to make sure they have those conversations with primary care physicians. One area in which family doctors have probably been a little bit underutilized is in the actual vaccine rollout itself. And the reason for that is because, of course, there's in reality very few people who are ardent anti-vaxxers. But there are lots of people who are vaccine hesitant, we would call, or vaccine questioning, just because most people are not medical or biomedical experts and they have legitimate questions or concerns. The relationship, though, of an individual with their family doctor is typically very strong, right? Because that family physician knows your medical history. It's a very intimate, close relationship. And so the ability of a family physician to give confidence to one of their patients about getting a vaccine is much stronger than someone going to a mass vaccination clinic where someone who they've never met before is immunizing them and there's tons of people around and maybe not a lot of time for a conversation.
Right.
So definitely the way to overcome that, of course, is that even if you might not be getting the vaccine at your family doctor's office, if you are concerned, have that conversation with them, and then hopefully they'll be able to reassure you that even if you need to go to a pharmacy or a mass vaccination center, that you can be confident in knowing that the vaccine is going to be safe and effective for you.
Of course. Another question from the community is, what do you think will change once we return to life as it was pre-pandemic? An example that we've seen this in history is, for example, in the 1918 pandemic, before they were using wooden bathrooms, and afterwards we switched to the bathrooms that we see today. Of course, with 2020 and 2021, we won't see that big of a change. But what do you think will change in sort of our behaviors and our sort of day-to-day life?
So I think one thing that's likely to change for a lot of people in Western countries is the normalization of mask wearing, which I think could be a very good thing overall. This is something that in a lot of Asian countries, has been routine practice for quite a long time. It's very usual to see people wearing masks, and that is an infection control measure during flu season. When you're traveling on a plane, it's likely to be really effective. It's likely that a lot of people will be a lot healthier by that very simple practice. So I think seeing more of that, even as the pandemic ends, and now there's all these very fashionable masks, so it's even easier than it has been in the past to do this, I guess. That's one thing that I think will likely change in the long term. I think another thing that's getting a lot of attention now is a focus on ventilation systems in buildings, and how best practices in terms of controlling air circulation and having good ventilation can substantially reduce the risk of infection transmission. And so that's something that a lot of people, on the ground won't see necessarily, but I think it's an engineering practice that's already being discussed and adopted in places like schools and congregate living settings like long-term care homes. And I think that's something that we'll likely see a lot more attention paid to going forward as well.
Of course, yeah, and with a virus as dense as SARS-CoV-2, which is much denser than air, doesn't go airborne that long. For example, people who are closer to an AC that's pushing the opposite direction, the virus might infect people who are closer to that source rather than the people who are farther away. And
yeah,
there were a bunch of articles that were rolling out regarding that specific sort of idea, where we need to have it ventilated on both areas to prevent the virus from spreading far away or too close, right?
Absolutely, that's right. So there's been sort of there was a lot of controversy and confusion early in the pandemic about what's meant by airborne transmission and the difference between droplets and aerosols. And I think that a lot of that was misguided. Droplets are things that are in the air for a certain amount of time, right? But they fall down quite quickly because of their size, and aerosols are the same thing, but just smaller. But both droplets and aerosols are much bigger than virus and can accommodate viral particles. The issue is really probabilistic. So the closer you are to someone and the longer you're close to them, the more likely they are to transmit to you. That's a simple concept that most people can easily wrap their head around. Right. And the reason for that is because you're, one, more likely to be exposed to these large lipid droplets, right, which travel short distances, but also aerosols that are more densely concentrated the closer you are to the person who's generating them. So it's also the case that an aerosol droplet is likely to contain much less virus than a bigger lipid droplet. And so the probability that if you're exposed to that, you're going to get infected decreases. And certainly the situations where we've seen transmission indoors that appears to occur over longer distances, it's been in settings, as you alluded to, where ventilation wasn't ideal. And typically there's been some sort of unidirectional airflow that's carried those aerosol particles from an infected individual, in a particular direction, and has kept them relatively concentrated.
Mm-hmm. Of course. Okay. Another headline that has been sort of misguided by the media is, why do we see females get a marginally worse adverse effects than males after getting the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, for example?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something that is observed regularly, and I think we still don't completely understand the basis for that, but it's something that is observed relatively frequently. And it's likely that there are we know that there are sex-based differences in the way that our immune systems respond. And it's very likely that the immune response of females is simply more vigorous than it is in males, and that contributes to the higher rates of some of these typically modest adverse side effects. You know, we know, for example, that in general, women tend to mount better antibody responses than men do. And that's driven by some of these inflammatory mediators that are actually what's responsible for making us feel kind of miserable sometimes after we get a vaccine. The sort of muscle soreness and the injection site pain, those are all signs of our immune system doing what we want it to do. And so the modestly higher rates of some of these sort of typical side effects of vaccination that we see occurring more frequently in females is likely a function of these sex-based differences in the way that our immune systems behave.